It's Wednesday, August 16th, 2017, and this is Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur. And today I've got two segments. You'll hear me say that exact same intro to some degree later on because I've recorded an interview with Minnesota Vikings fan, LA comedian, improviser, actor Luke McDonough, which you can hear after the first segment. So keep tuning in throughout to hear the perspective of a Minnesota Vikings fan, what he grew up with in terms of with the Vikings, his outlook in terms of Dalvin Cook and missing Adrian Peterson, and some of his favorite movies that took place in Minnesota. So stay tuned later on in the Seaside Chats podcast for that. Something I didn't do at the end of that talk was really give an outro. So, you can follow us on Twitter at Field Gulls or myself at Kenneth Arthur S. And obviously checking out fieldgulls.com, where today on Wednesday, we had two articles looking at the Seahawks offensive line performance against the LA Chargers in their preseason opener on Sunday. And if you know anything about the Seahawks offensive line, you know that you can never have too much talk or too much coverage about what's going on because people really eat it up, much like how defenders are going to eat up Russell Wilson if they don't do a better job of protecting it. Am I right? Okay.
You are correct.
And that is the voice of my first guest here, who will be talking about the offensive line. He wrote one of those pieces, Ben Baldwin. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, man. Let's start off with a couple basics. How long have you been following the Seahawks?
So I grew up in Seattle, so the Seahawks were just kind of generally on TV, but nobody paid a whole lot of attention to them because, especially in the early 90s, the Huskies were really good and the Seahawks were less good. And then through the late 90s, they didn't really do much. And then in 2002, I went off to college in California and really didn't follow sports much at all. And then eventually I moved to DC and finished grad school and actually had free time again, started following sports in general, but more specifically the Seahawks, really starting in 2013 and then especially in 2014. So compared to a lot of people at Field Gulls, not a whole long time.
That's perfectly okay. And, it's fodder for the people that do make fun of Seahawks fans and say they're new.
Yes.
You really dragged us down, Ben.
So I've shared this on Twitter, but after Super Bowl 40 against the Steelers, I was so mad that the next football game I watched after that was the divisional round loss to Atlanta in 2012.
Good. Great.
I rendered you speechless.
At least you got the next year they came through. So,
Yeah, it was good timing.
Yeah. So at least, you've got most of Russell Wilson's career in there. Since that loss to the Falcons in the divisional round of the playoffs. And in that time, the offensive line has taken focus. And even when it was average, people called it bad, or if it was good, people called it average. And it's sort of this whole fallacy that they should be keeping the whole team together, which they can't do. Some position had to suffer, and it seems that the Seahawks have really stuck their foot in the ground with the offensive line being the group that is going to have to be good from their rookie contract standpoint so that they can pay players otherwise. And having a quarterback like Russell Wilson, maybe that pushes the needle even further towards having an offensive line that isn't that great at pass protection, in believing that Wilson, who has remained durable and athletic and can get around these plays maybe to some degree, and committing to the run game can help them somewhat. But the offensive line was really bad in 2016. The running game suffered. Russell Wilson's health suffered, and it's something that they had to address. So they went out, they drafted Ethan Posick in the second round. They signed Luke Jokel to a contract that'll pay him like $8 million this year. They signed Ode Abushi. They've got a first-round pick in Jermaine Ifedi, and they're trying to make something work. But this was our first look at what could be the first team offensive line against the Chargers on Sunday. You came in, Ben, like we all did, with some expectation. After watching the game, overall, the offensive line below, at, above your expectations?
I would I'm going to break this into two pieces and say that I'm extremely encouraged by the 60% of the offensive line that plays from the middle out towards the left. So I thought Fant, Jokel, and Britt were, in the snaps I watched, I don't remember any of them allowing any pressures, which is great. And we've been burned in the past by Seahawks coaching staff talking up development of offensive linemen. So I think people were pretty dubious about Fant actually improving because he really did struggle last year, especially in the playoff games. But he looked solid, and a lot of people have said similar things. So I think that is very encouraging because having a bad left tackle is extremely problematic. On the other hand, having a bad right tackle is also problematic if they cannot protect the quarterback, and that's what really motivated me to do this piece on field goals, was to look at all the snaps that either Ifedi or Postic played at right tackle and see in pass protection and see if there was any difference between the two.
Yeah, and that difference was, pretty remarkable. I mean, for you, would you say that the Jermaine Ifedi situation at right tackle, if it continues at this pace, how can they continue? What do you see them doing over the next 2 to 3 weeks?
So I think this is, I guess, my biggest tension as a Seahawks fan is I think they should prioritize the passing game. I think everything we've learned about football in the last few years has shown that there's been an increased emphasis on passing. Bill Barnwell had this piece this morning where he said that the direct quote is, "The NFL in 2017 is all about throwing the ball and stopping other teams from throwing the ball." And I really don't think the Seahawks coaching staff agrees with this. So they make a lot of decisions based on the run game. So I think that most people would agree that at this point, the evidence points to Ifedi being a better run blocker and Postic being a better pass blocker. So if they choose Ifedi to be right tackle, it's not because they are misevaluating the players, it's because they are emphasizing the rushing game over the passing game. And I guess we just have to come to grips with that.
And well, if they make a decision, I mean, because how much has the game changed from 2013 or 2014 when the Seahawks went to the Super Bowl compared to 2017?
Not a lot, and that's fair. But in 2014, especially, the rushing game was like historically dominant.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. I'm not sure if there was a team that has had a better rushing DVOA in the almost 30 years that it's been recorded. So if we got back to that, that would be great. But the odds are that that's probably not going to happen. And especially because that required Marshawn Lynch in his prime rushing for 1,400 yards or whatever it was, and Russell Wilson rushing for 850 yards. Those things, we don't have Marshawn Lynch, and I don't think the coaches are comfortable with having Wilson rush that often anymore.
Well, in 2015, I mean, talk about moving towards the passing game after, right around the time, maybe a game or two before Jimmy Graham got hurt, but in those last 6 or 7 games, Russell Wilson was as dominant as any quarterback that we typically see ever. Some of the best numbers that we've ever seen from a quarterback over a certain stretch towards the end of the year. What can they do? And a lot of those players that were on the offensive line then aren't players that we hold up in high regard now. What do you think that the Seahawks could do to sort of set Russell Wilson up for those most successful types of games for him to have, besides just, if he's healthy, looking at the weapons that he has, and the offensive line combinations we could see, how do you see the Seahawks best setting up Russell Wilson to, go back to maybe having the dominant performance? Because, at the end of the day, it does seem like the defense, is going to do what they do. And hopefully, that'll still play a significant, huge factor in them winning a Super Bowl, perhaps more so than even Russell Wilson would be if the Seahawks defense can play like it did over stretches from 2012 to 2015, that there are the moments and opportunities there that whether or not they're facing Aaron Rodgers or the Cowboys with Ezekiel Elliott and Dak Prescott and Des Bryant, or the Falcons, that no matter who they face, if the defense can stop them, that probably is more important even than Russell Wilson having an MVP campaign. But him having an MVP campaign also would be very good. What can the Seahawks best do you think, to set him up for that?
I think it really, so I feel repetitive here, but I think it really goes to pass protection. And at the end of the stretch in 2015, Wilson himself was playing very well, but he was also having time in the pocket to go through progressions, to be able to drop back and wait for routes down the field to develop. And at that point, the tackles were, I think it was Gilliam, right, at right tackle, and then Okung at left tackle. So I guess, so the best case scenario is that Fant turns into Okung, which at this point seems like a stretch, but if that's what we're hoping for, then that's we just have to hope that he makes that jump, and because that's really the only alternative at this point, I think, and hope that either Ifidi can develop into a good pass blocking right tackle, which I'm kind of skeptical about, at least at this point of his career, or that they kick Ifidi inside and put Posick at right tackle. And
did you come out? Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. And it's not that I'm even high on Posick. It's just that people, from watching both his college tape and the performance on Sunday, it just looks like he cannot move in space. And just imagine him going against Harry on the Packers or the pass rushers on the Cardinals. It's just like, it terrifies me imagining Golden or Chandler Jones at the Cardinals rushing him, and I just cannot see the offense functioning well like that.
Well, that is another point of the tape here, which is, I think the Chargers have arguably one of the most underrated front seven units in the NFL, or maybe it's properly rated, but I mean, at full strength right now with Joey Bosa, Corey Liuget, Melvin Ingram, there's some really talented players, at least in terms of rushing the passer. And even in the photo here for the article, which I selected after I had selected one that was the exact same photo for another article that was just posted for Coleman. It's Ifidi versus Joey Bosa, who, for my money, was a top 5 pass rusher last year. So
yep.
How much does that factor into what Ifidi did on Sunday?
Yep. One disadvantage of preseason is there's no coaches film available. So in some of the clips, it's pretty hard to tell who Ifidi is going up against and who Posick is going up against. But on average, because Posick's only snaps at right tackle, where in the second half, yes, he is going to be going against worse defenders. And that's a problem with kind of these eye test things, like going through the film or with PFF grades, as they don't adjust who you're going up against. So Joey Bosa is going to get pressure because he's Joey Bosa, and not necessarily because of the offensive player.
Is there anything you like for offensive linemen? Let's say that the Seahawks traded for or signed an offensive lineman, in a couple weeks, like after cuts or something like that, and they bring someone in. Is there a website or a stat or anything that you go to that sort of gives you an idea of how good that player is? Because it is so hard to evaluate sometimes as a perspective from someone who's not watching every player and every offensive line and every team every day. Is there anything that you default to?
Yep, that's a great question. The first thing I look at is the Football Outsiders Almanac publishes stats from the previous season that tells you how many blown blocks they had in both the passing game and rushing game. And blown blocks here mean that the offensive player was beat and it resulted in either a pressure or a sack or a knockdown in the pass game, or a run defeat, I think, in the rushing game. So that's kind of the data-driven thing, is how, in aggregate over the course of the season, how many pressures or failures in the rushing game is this player allowing. And then for the eye test, I'm pretty anti PFF, so I like Bleacher. Well, I wouldn't say like. I look at Bleacher Report's NFL 1000 grades, and I prefer it to PFF at least because it's more transparent in that you know exactly who's doing the grades and exactly how they're coming up with their numbers. So they have different categories where they rate how well they think a lineman does in different categories. And then I can't remember them off the top of my head, but at least you can kind of tell how they're arriving at these grades.
Yeah, that's maybe my biggest problem with the PFF is the lack of transparency. Is that something that is that the reason that you shy away from them for the most
Yep.
part, or is there anything else that you sort of disagree with?
For trenches, for all positions, lack of transparency is the big one for me. And for skill position players, I think I fundamentally disagree with how they grade plays. So each play has a -2, -1, 0, 1, or 2. And the problem with doing this on skill position players is it doesn't properly account for the value of explosive plays. So it's basically like success rate, but not taking into account the kind of home run hitter plays. And we know those plays are really valuable.
Yeah. And looking ahead to next year, what problems do you see potentially popping up with the offensive line? It's early. Obviously, we don't know what could happen with George Fant. Maybe he's good. Maybe he needs to be replaced again at left tackle. Maybe make another move there. Maybe Feedy never figures it out, and then they have to move on from him. But they've got the Justin Britt extension. They've got Justin Britt entering free agency. They've got Jokel entering free agency. Do you see these things in terms of the long-term or one-year outlook for the Seahawks offensive line? Are they kind of in a really bad position, or is it maybe better than it looks?
I don't think they're in a great position. And they talk about, both John and Pete love to talk about the importance of continuity on the offensive line, and it hasn't really come together. And looking at this next offseason, if Jokel, Britt, and Ibushi end up being the interior 3 linemen, all of their contracts are up after this season. So there could very well be a massive turnover in the line again, which kind of worries me. And even if they play well this season, then it's going to cost money to retain them. And who knows if we'll have money when we need to. There's still Jamie Graham's a free agent. I guess Britt I already talked about. So
yeah. And the Seahawks this week face the Minnesota Vikings on Friday for their preseason week 2. We should see more of the starters as usual, since we're ramping up closer to preseason week 3, when it'll be at least maybe a half of the starters. What are you looking for this week? The Vikings, they aren't slouches at the front 7. They've got Everson Griffin, they've got Linval Joseph. What are you looking for this week? Obviously, the right side of the line you want to see improvement on, but what else would you be looking for this week?
Yeah, and they have Danielle Hunter too, who is also very good.
Yeah,
I really the right side of the offensive line is like the main thing that I care a lot about, and I think like in terms of what will make or break the Seahawks season this year, I think that is the most important thing that will come out of recent things like who will be the 5th or 6th receiver, what will be the running back depth chart, what's the Sam linebacker rotation going to look like. Like, I understand why fans are interested in those, and they like things like that in the preseason impact who will actually make the roster. But in terms of the success of the Seahawks in 2017, it's really offensive line, and then to a lesser extent, who will be playing outside cornerback next to Sherman. I think those are the two things that I care a lot about.
Yeah, and I want to keep going with in terms of, what do you think of this, or what do you think of that? What did you think of the running backs? What did you think of Wilson? What did you think of Boykin? But at the end of the day, these preseason games, especially preseason week 1, it seems like you maybe get a few things out of it, but really it's mostly, it seems, for the coaches so that they can implement changes maybe in practice for the next week and then continue to mold from there. And so I feel like the best time to talk about the Seahawks in terms of the way they'll be moving forward in 2017 is probably after week 3 against the Chiefs. Would you say that that's probably pretty much true to glean off of these first 2 preseason games?
Yeah, I would agree with that. Just seeing how, seeing especially the offense, seeing how they come together or don't come together. Although even with that, it's hard because I think in 2015 they really struggled in the preseason, and then they ended up finishing number 1 in offensive DVOA that year. So although they did get off to a slow start, so maybe there will be some correlation with how they look in the third preseason game and how they start the season. But by November and December, who knows what they'll look like.
Well, that's another thing that could be, its own subject for an article, several articles, a podcast, is just how consistently Pete Carroll's teams for the Seahawks have not been good in the first half and been phenomenal, historically good, probably from a DVOA standpoint, if you just took it from week 9 on. And I don't know if you or someone else has put out any theories or stats to back up why that would be, but it does seem interesting that Carroll's teams don't really heat up until November.
Yep. The Seahawks under Carroll have played 7 seasons, and they have won their first road game 1 time, and that was in 2013 at Carolina.
And this is a team that's been in the second round for the last 5 years, and in 2010. So, and finally, I just one more, because I haven't had a chance to talk about it this week, and I think we gotta, for myself on this podcast, I gotta bring him up at least once a week. What did you think of Chris Carson?
So he definitely passed the eye test, and I think a lot of people after the game were talking about him, and especially that the second TD he had where he just plowed over the defender, which is so much fun to watch. But then when you go back and look at the stats, none of the running backs really did that well. I think it was something like, as a team, the running backs had 27 carries for 80-something yards, and it was less than 3 yards a carry. So for a team that is trying to prioritize the run game is not doing that well. And it's hard to actually evaluate it because they're not like Rawls, Procise, and Lacey. None of them got a ton of carries. They're not using Russell Wilson as a rushing threat. So all of this could change, but still, I wouldn't call it super encouraging, even if Carson did have a couple of runs that looked really cool.
Yeah. Well, we'll see how he does this week against the Vikings, as well as the offensive line and the secondary for the Seahawks, and sort of find out what's going on with some of these injuries around Paul Richardson and KJ Wright. And hopefully, nothing too serious, but mostly I think we're all excited to get to week 3 against the Chiefs. And then, of course, week 1 against the Green Bay Packers in Lambeau Field, once football counts again. Ben Baldwin, you can follow him on Twitter at Guga31BB, Guga. Any insight into what Guga means?
So this was the AOL Instant Messenger name I chose when I was in 7th grade, and at the time I had this tennis player I really liked whose name was Gustavo Kuerten, and his nickname was Guga. So I've been stuck with that for the last 20 years or something. BB are my initials, and the 31 was my favorite basketball player at the time, Reggie Miller.
Oh my God, Reggie Miller was my favorite basketball player.
No way, he was. I wore his jersey to elementary school all the time.
Me too. I was
nice.
I was shunned because I was a Pacers fan, not a Sonics fan.
Yeah, I didn't admit it to anybody, so nobody shunned me, but I kind of was too. Yeah.
By 96, I was a Sonics fan, but over the course of 20 years, it turns out I chose the wrong team because there was no Sonics. So
yeah, Pacers have won a lot more games than the Sonics recently.
Yeah, that's true. And Reggie Miller was a beast, so I don't think anyone can deny that. Ben, thanks for joining us. Please follow him on Twitter for a bunch of great tweets and videos and stats, breakdowns. Breakdowns is a word. Thanks, Ben, again for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I will see you on the internet.
See you on the internet.